we're here for the Creeks Advisory Committee meeting, and I'd like to officially call the meeting to order. I'd also just like to take a moment and, I don't know if honor is the right word, but acknowledge a lot of the tragic events that have happened recently, and all those that were deeply impacted by those events, and also express gratitude for the first responders and public works and all the folks involved with the search and recovery and cleanup of the area. Not very eloquent, sorry. All right, do I do roll call? Jen, would you please do roll call for us?
Ms. Weber? Ms. Owens?
Here.
Mr. Moldaver? Ms. Close? Thank you.
And I believe we just had one of our liaisons join us. Does she? You don't have to go up. Oh, lucky you. All right. So our first item of business this evening is the approval of the minutes from the November 15th, 2017 Advisory Committee meeting.
Madam Chair, move approval of the draft minutes of the November meeting as submitted.
All right, thanks, Lee. We have to make a motion. Can I get a second, please?
Second that.
Excellent, thanks. All in favor? No. Aye. We were all there. And Cameron, any agenda adjustments for this evening?
Madam Chair, thanks.
Thanks. All right, at this time, we have a couple folks here joining us in the audience today. I would like to invite, did you want to speak during public comment? Or was there a specific item? Okay, well, I'll keep that on standby then. And then Becky, you're welcome to provide your comments. Just have a step up there. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks. I'll take a quick second to introduce myself. My name's Becky Toohey. I'm with Heal the Ocean, relatively new. And coming in during all this is really hard and kind of emotional for us at Heal the Ocean, like everyone here. And the public comment that we were thinking about today in preparation for this meeting was really recognizing that this was the slides really affected the creek system in Montecito, and we're wondering what the Creeks Committee or other agencies, departments in Santa Barbara are doing to look at risky creeks here in Santa Barbara. But really, if there's anything that we can do to help, we'd love to be a part of that. So that's really what we'd like to say.
Great, thanks. Did you want to say anything?
With the public comment, I don't think we can respond directly to that, but I think it's important just to note the topography around here. We have really steep mountains, very flashy creeks, and when we have wildfire combined with that, and very intense rains or lots of rain where we have saturated hillsides, we have risk of debris flows and mud flows and flash flooding. They're like I said, they're very flashy creeks, and so we do work in the Creeks Division in our Parks and Recreation Department works closely with our Public Works Department when we're looking at work around the creeks, as well as with our Community Development Department in terms of planning. One of the things we're going to be talking about later tonight involves planning and development around creeks, and one of the issues involved in that is the safety of people who are going to be using those structures, and we work closely with the flood control district as well. So we try to really integrate all of those different interests and disciplines together in all of our work.
Thanks for that, Cameron. I don't think we have any other folks care to public comment. I think we covered everybody there. Next item, committee member and staff communications. Yes, Lee, thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to follow up on the public comment and Mr. Benson's explanation by reminding the community that on the evening of Thursday the 25th, which if you're watching this live is a week from tomorrow, at the Faulkner Gallery at 6:30, there's going to be a forum on creeks and watersheds from the perspective of what we learned from the fire and the flood and the mud slides. And this is the second in a series, is being co-sponsored by the Urban Creeks Council and the Planning Association. It's going to feature Dr. Ed Keller from UCSB, the former chair of environmental studies, who is an emeritus professor of geology, and his main area of specialization is the geological history of the physical structures of the Tri-Counties, the watersheds that go through them, and why certain features are in certain places and how they've shifted over time. Jeff Green from the Foundation for Santa Barbara City College is going to moderate. There's several other very distinguished guests invited. This is free and open to the public. It is Thursday, the 25th, Faulkner Gallery, Downtown Library at 6:30 p.m. So people who want to get more information about what the potential risk is during rainy seasons for the next few years since the fire, I think Professor Keller will probably have a lot of interesting information and may even be willing to stick his head out for a forecast.
Great. Thanks for sharing information about that, Lee. Sounds really interesting. All righty. Any other communications, Cameron? Excellent. Moving right along. Item number 7, election of the vice chair for this coming year.
So, Madam Chair, I'll just say a few words about this. So, our normal process is at our December meeting, the committee elects a vice chair. That person serves as vice chair for the following year and then moves into the spot of chair of the committee 1 year later. Our December meeting was canceled because of the Thomas fire, and so we're doing that tonight, and we're going to nominate and hopefully select someone to take over as vice chair. And then at our next meeting in February, Mr. Moldaver, who is the current vice chair, will take over as chair of the committee. And Madam Chair, you get to retire for a while. So so I'll just turn it back over to the committee to make a nomination and then run your campaigns and then have an election. Good luck.
Well, there. Lee, did you want to make the nomination since you did the work? I'm happy to do it. I hear we have a volunteer who's present with us this evening. One of our newer Creeks Advisory Committee members, Christy, has volunteered to step up and serve as the vice chair for this upcoming year. So I would like to formally nominate Christy Close.
Second the motion.
Excellent. Thanks, Christy. We really appreciate it. It'll be fun. All right. And that's all our business there. Oh, do we need to make a first? Final vote, please. Told you I didn't learn this yet. All in favor? Aye. Excellent. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Betsy. All right. So that was our vice chair. And then I'll pass it back to Cameron for the 2018 subcommittee appointments.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. The purpose for this item is for the committee to review the existing subcommittees we have for the Creeks Advisory Committee and to determine what committees to retain moving forward this year and to appoint members of those subcommittees. So currently we have 2 subcommittees, and the staff is recommending that we maintain both of those. One is a standing committee, and that's our budget subcommittee. Generally speaking, the makeup of that committee, I should say, all of the committees are limited to a maximum of 3 people, so that we don't have any kind of Brown Act violations. The budget subcommittee is normally made up of the chair and the vice chair and the immediate past chair. It doesn't have to remain that way, but that's the way we've done it for several years. So, with regard to that committee, my recommendation would be to Madam Chair, for you to appoint yourself as the outgoing chair, Mr. Moldaver as the incoming chair, and Ms. Close as the new vice chair to the budget subcommittee. And then the other committee we have is an ad hoc committee, and that's our Public Outreach and Education Committee. The ad hoc committees are formed for some specific purpose, and in this case, we're working on water quality public opinion survey, and then taking the results of that and integrating that into our public education plan going forward. So our current members of the Outreach and Education Committee are Chair Owens, Ms. Weber, and Ms. Lomas, who's not here, so an easy target for reappointment. So I'll leave that up to you to consider and make the appointments. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Cameron. Does anybody have any comments about the committees or any motions they'd like to make?
Madam Chair, I would move to concur with the staff recommendation.
Excellent. Any other comments or anything? All right. All in favor? Oh, I need a second. Sorry. Second. Thank you, Christy, for the second. And now all in favor. Aye.
And just to clarify, so for the Outreach and Education Subcommittee, the membership will stay the same?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Alrighty, and now on to business items. First up, we have the Stormwater Management Program Report. We have Jim Rumbley here, the Creeks Associate Planner, to provide us with a presentation. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. First, I'll start talking about some background of our stormwater management program. Then we'll get into some components, all the 6 components of our stormwater management program. We'll talk about a recent program audit that we went through, and then we'll get into some reporting requirements and upcoming permit requirements for the program. You can think of our city's stormwater management program just as a group of mandatory requirements that have their roots in the Clean Water Act, but they're intended to improve water quality. The state and regional water boards oversee the program and our permit. The Creeks Division provides the overall coordination for the city. However, it's the responsibility of all city employees to make sure that permit requirements are followed. The city's stormwater management program consists of 6 primary components. We have construction runoff control, illicit discharge detection and elimination, outreach, post-construction, water quality monitoring, and our newest component, trash capture. Construction runoff control is the first component we'll talk about. This is essentially where a construction project will need to control the sediment on site whenever there's ground disturbance. The erosion and sediment control is necessary for these projects, and applicants are required to submit a plan that has best management practices that will dictate how the sediment will be kept on site. Last year, our Building and Safety Division reviewed 272 erosion and sediment control plans, and Building and Safety is required to maintain inspection records and keep an inventory of current projects that have erosion and sediment control plans. Here's an example of a generic erosion and sediment control plan for a construction project. It's a little difficult to see, but on here we have measures like a sediment basin, erosion control blankets, straw rolls. There's also specified locations where the restroom facilities, a concrete washout, and a construction entrance are located. And those are all designed to best keep sediment on site when it rains. Illicit discharge detection and elimination is another component of our program. The Creeks Division has a full-time code enforcement officer whose job is to respond to illicit discharge reports as soon as they're received. Ideally, we can respond immediately, but our permit requirement is to respond within 24 hours. There's a hotline that I encourage you all to call if you ever see an illicit discharge. That's 897-2688. That's our code enforcement officer's direct line, and if you call during business hours, you're likely to get Chris to answer the phone. We're also required to train all field staff annually, and this is to make sure that people out in the field know what an illicit discharge is, and so they don't commit an illicit discharge. But also, they're our eyes in the field. Chris is only one guy, and it really helps to have all city employees looking out for illicit discharges. Last year, we received 135 reports of illicit discharges, and we responded to all of those within 24 hours. Outreach is another component of our stormwater management program. We have a full-time outreach coordinator that implements education and outreach related to improving creek and ocean water quality. Specifically, our outreach coordinator coordinates presentations in schools, volunteer opportunities, and is the primary person organizing Creek Week for the city, which includes a very popular Land Shark Tour, which I encourage you all to go on if you haven't already. It sells that every year, so get your tickets early. So one of our permit requirements for this year is a public awareness survey. Every 5 years, we have to do this public awareness survey to make sure that our outreach message is being understood and to see if we might want to pivot and do some other types of outreach. Our current media campaign that our outreach coordinator has been working on is Creekman. You might have seen this bus ad. We also have some television commercials featuring Creekman. Post-construction is another component of our program, and this is what I work mostly on. This is what I spend most of my time on. It's kind of a weird, jargony term, but you can think of post-construction as the ongoing treatment of stormwater after a construction project is completed. So whenever you want to do a construction project in the city and it requires design review, you're likely to have some form of post-construction requirements. And really, you can think of these as all the types of treatment to treat stormwater when it falls on impervious area. So permeable pavers, permeable concrete, bioswales, bioretention systems, infiltration basins, those are all methods of treating stormwater before it leaves the site. So our highest level of post-construction, we call it Tier 3. So at a minimum, a Tier 3 project will have to treat the first inch of rain that falls on all impervious area on the entire parcel. So some recent projects that you might be familiar with that are Tier 3 projects: the Mark, that new apartment complex on Upper State that was just completed; Arlington Village, which is the apartment complex being constructed right next to the Arlington Theater; the Children's Museum; the Cabrillo Pavilion and Bathhouse, which is going to be starting very soon, if not already. Those are all Tier 3 projects. So they'll be treating all of their stormwater before it leaves the site. We'll go through some examples of what we call BMPs, the methods of treating stormwater. Permeable pavers are a very popular option. On the left, we have a permeable paver that has gaps in between the pavers. The paver itself is not permeable, but water falls on that paver and then moves to the sides and flows through the gap, which is often filled with rock or aggregate. Lately, we've been seeing more of the permeable paver on the right, and that's a hydroflow paver. It's a little bit different than what you might be used to. There's no gaps for the stormwater to flow between. The stormwater actually flows through the paver itself. The paver itself is permeable. And that's a popular option for a designer that doesn't want the look of an aggregate-filled gap. Permeable concrete is another common BMP that we see. It looks a little different than concrete, but what distinguishes it from regular concrete is there's fewer fines. There's not as much sand in there. So it creates these void spaces in the concrete and allows water to percolate through the concrete really easily. Contractors like this because it's a little bit cheaper than permeable pavers. Here's an example of a bioswale. This is a bioswale in downtown, and this whole parking lot drains to a bioswale. And then at the end of the bioswale, there's a retention basin. That's the ideal design. So the bioswale will kind of slow water down. You don't get a lot of infiltration in the bioswale, though, because the water is moving quickly. You'll get some, but ideally there'll be a retention basin at the end, so the water can pool and then percolate down into the ground. Here's a couple examples of bioretention planters. These are really popular where there's not a lot of room to do stormwater treatment. On the left, you can see a couple of downspouts from the roof going into the top of that bioretention basin. And the water will slowly percolate down into the soil. And these can be designed with an underdrain if infiltration isn't okay on site, or they can be an open bottom and percolate into the ground. The photo on the left is kind of a unique design. This is a building downtown, and it's a lot line to lot line building, and there's very little room on the building for stormwater treatment. So the engineers came up with an innovative design to have the bioretention on the roof in between the first and second floors. You can make it out on the right of the building there. There's a couple of downspouts that drain the entire roof there. Water quality monitoring is another component of our stormwater management program. We have a research coordinator that every year she comes up with a research and monitoring plan based on permit requirements and just general interest for water quality of what we're going to do for monitoring that year. So this year, we're looking at doing some dry weather sampling of all of our outfalls. We're doing some increased monitoring of impaired water bodies for bacteria and toxicity, hopefully to gather data to get those water bodies delisted at some point. We also have a special study to quantify pollutant load. And to help us with that, we have a pollutant load reduction model, the simple Santa Barbara model, that Jill Murray, our research coordinator, she actually came up with that and proposed it to the water board as an alternative to the popular model that other communities are using. This is going to save us a lot of staff time, and we think it's a much better model and a simpler model than what was being proposed. Trash capture is our newest permit component, and we're not actually required to comply with this yet, but we anticipate we'll begin to be required to start doing this in 2 to 3 years. So it'll start with our next permit. And once we're required to implement trash capture, we'll have 10 years to fully implement this. And what we're going to be required to do is at certain priority areas, which include all bus stops, all commercial areas, industrial areas, mixed-use areas, and high-density areas, we're going to be required to prevent trash larger than 5 millimeters from entering the storm drain system. 5 millimeters is about the diameter of a cigarette butt. So while we have screens on our catch basins right now, they're too big. They'd let cigarette butts through. So we're going to have to do something else to comply with this trash amendment. So there's a couple options we've been looking at. On the left is a CDS unit. This is a large in-ground system that we would install in line with a storm drain below a street. They're really expensive, but you can see, well, you can't really see it on the diagram, but I'll kind of explain it. The stormwater flows into the CDS unit, and there's kind of a vortex action, and it separates out trash and sediment. And then the water free of trash and sediment will continue on downstream. On the right is a connector pipe screen. This is the inside of a catch basin. And while these are really cheap to install, we would need a lot of them to do the same work as a CDS unit. So these are cheap, the CDS unit is expensive, and it becomes a maintenance issue over time. What's going to work best in a watershed? The CDS unit might allow us to eliminate or not install between 50 and 100 of these connector pipe screens. To maintain them, each of them would need a Vactor truck, a vacuum truck, to come and suck out all the sediment and trash. So it's just a matter of finding the right mix of what's best for the city and what's best for each area. In June of 2016, our program underwent an audit. A couple of people from the regional board came down and worked with us for a day to look at our post-construction and illicit discharge components of our program. The regional board staff wanted to see several construction projects. They're most interested in post-construction and looked at plans of several construction projects. And after looking at those plans, they wanted to see several of them in the field. So we went out and looked at 5 of these projects. Well, what came out of that was they found that 3 of the sites didn't have their post-construction components installed correctly. And we received a notice of violation warning letter. So that was in November of 2016. We responded in March with how we were going to remedy those issues. The regional board had some questions in September, and we responded in October. And we don't anticipate hearing any more about this violation. We don't anticipate there being fines. However, we did learn the importance of making sure that post-construction measures are installed properly and that they actually work. So one thing we're doing now to hopefully keep violations from happening in the future is for these Tier 3 projects that we talked about earlier, these large construction projects, we are requiring the engineer of record that designed the post-construction measures to submit a letter to the building inspector before the project gets signed off, stating that everything was installed properly and as approved. We have lots of program reporting requirements each year. The Creeks Division compiles an annual report every year, and we're working with every city division, and the city divisions are keeping track of these requirements all year long, and then they submit a report to us, and we kind of compile it all and then send it up to the regional board to make sure that everything that we pass, that we complied with all requirements. Our most recent report was submitted in October, and we'll have another one due at the end of this year, or at the end of this fiscal year in October. We're currently in the last year of a 5-year permit that began in 2013. So in July, our permit officially ends, but we'll continue to comply with all permit requirements until a new permit's issued. And we don't have a date for when that new permit's been issued. We don't think it's going to happen immediately. We've heard up to 2 years after this permit expires. But we'll just wait and keep doing what we're doing until we get word that the new permit's issued. So we've talked about some background information. We've talked about all the components of the stormwater management program. We talked about the audit and some of the reporting requirements. If you all have any questions about our program, I'm happy to answer those for you now.
Thanks, Jim. Any questions from the committee? We'll start with Lee and then Christy.
By coincidence, today at lunchtime at a forum on the future of housing in Santa Barbara County, the Assistant City Attorney Scott Vincent went over a laundry list of new laws and new amendments and pending modification laws from the state legislature having to do with how cities and counties and special districts deal with accessory dwelling units. And one of the points that several of the current laws have is that they're intended to be exempt from a lot of different especially local standards and hands-on or subjective review. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, because what we're doing now is the stormwater management capture program derives from federal legislation and state authorization and has fairly objective and quantifiable criteria for operation and success. Is it your understanding that these programs, as you described them today, will continue to be in place for all kinds of developments in the years to come?
Yeah, our post-construction program will be continuing indefinitely. As far as the accessory dwelling units go, many of those are exempt from design review. And if a project doesn't require design review, there are no post-construction requirements. That's part of our permit. However, if an accessory dwelling unit does, for some reason, need design review, often it's because it needs a modification. Built in the setback is the common one we see. If it needs a modification, that counts as discretionary review. And so if that happens, post-construction requirements are in effect for that project. But otherwise, if it just goes straight to the building permit and there is no design review, they're exempt from post-construction requirements.
Thanks, Jim. Any other questions, Lee? Nope. Christy?
Thanks, Jim, for that nice presentation. It was very informative. I have a question about the post-construction and whether or not there's any monitoring involved for your post-construction projects that are near any kind of aquatic system, for example, for water quality, sediment, invertebrates using like BMI, things like that. The reason I ask is because oftentimes I take issue with aquatic organism passage projects which don't look at before and after effects. So the assumption being that once you put in a bridge or a bottomless arch culvert, that you're actually passing fish through this new system. Oftentimes, though, monitoring is not executed, so it's a conundrum because we don't know the answer whether or not it's actually improved fish migration. So my question goes back to, do you perform post-construction any monitoring to see if your post-construction activities are effective or there's no difference between before and after?
Are you referring to water quality monitoring specifically?
In this particular case, but it could be even if you're, let's say, in a terrestrial system, you could be looking at bacterial counts, above and below the construction site, downstream or down, gradient.
Yeah, we've talked with our water quality coordinator about doing some of that, and I think we will eventually. We haven't yet, but it would be really interesting to know specifically bioretention. There's a lot of bioretention installed on site, and it would be good to know how effective it is at eliminating pollutant loading. I think we will end up doing some of that, but we don't have any set concrete plans to do it right now. We do 20 hours of inspections at completed projects to make sure they're still functioning. That's part of our permit requirements, but that's not water quality monitoring. That's me and possibly someone else going out on site and seeing if things were installed right and if they're still working. But it's a great idea. We should do some of that.
Thanks.
I would just add to that, I guess, that we do have pretty extensive monitoring for capital projects that the Creeks Division has done. So that's part of our annual research and monitoring plan. And so, for example, in this photograph here where we installed a permeable paver street, we are down there collecting any runoff that comes off of that site. Oftentimes on a site like that, we don't have any runoff. It basically takes everything that falls on it, and we just have no runoff, and then that water moves through the soil and is treated there. So virtually all of the Creeks Division capital projects go through post-construction monitoring because we're trying to look at where we're getting the biggest bang for our bucks in terms of best management practices for water quality improvement. In addition to that, with regard to kind of the bigger picture, the way these systems are set up, these are single projects coming through at a time and having, best management practices for stormwater treatment added to the project, and then when the project's built. So it's sort of an incremental. It was an incremental problem as the urban areas are developed, and so the solution that the Clean Water Act puts forward is kind of this incremental solution, and that's where the modeling that Jim mentioned goes to, looking at the pollutant load modeling, and so it's kind of looking at over time what improvements would you expect to see. That's just modeling. It's not actually out grabbing those samples. So, but like Jim said, we will probably get to that at some point. It's just, when does it become worthwhile in terms of the bigger picture impact to the creeks and the aquatic system?
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Christy. Any additional comments or questions?
That was it. Thanks. Thank you.
Those are good. Excellent. Thanks again, Jim. That was great. moving along to our second business item that was just for discussion, correct? No action needed. Excellent. I'll get the hang of this on my last round. Part two of our business items for this evening, the draft coastal land use plan. And so back at our November meeting, we received a great presentation from city staff that have worked long and hard on the Santa Barbara's coastal land use plan update. And we, due to the Thomas fire for the December meeting that was canceled, we're now moving on to discussion for the Creeks Advisory Committee to draft a letter of support for the updates. And so, Cameron, I'll pass it back to you.
Well, Madam Chair, this is the committee's item. This, as you just mentioned, back at our November meeting on November 15th, the committee received a presentation from City Planning Division staff on the draft coastal land use plan. And when that was placed on the agenda in November, it was placed on the agenda as an informational item for discussion. And at the end of the discussion, the committee expressed an interest in having that come back so it could take action and provide input or comments in the form of a letter to the Planning Division staff, as well as the Planning Commission and the City Council that will be reviewing the draft land use plan. So now you have to remember back 2 months to what you heard back then, and then your role is to have a discussion about that. And if you decide you'd like to send a letter, then you can direct me to what the contents of that letter would be. I will prepare a letter. Normally, what I've done in the past when the committee's done something like this is I'll prepare a draft and send it back just afterwards, just to the chair and the vice chair to review and make sure it's aligned with what the committee had intended. And then once I have their approval, then I'll forward the letter to the recipients. So have at it. I'm sorry. One other thing I wanted to introduce, Melissa Hetrick is a project planner with the city's planning division, and she's been one of the lead staff responsible for preparing this and working with the Coastal Commission and other staff across the city to prepare this draft. So she's here and available if the committee has any questions or would like to refresh your recollection about anything. She's here to help us out. Thanks.
And thanks, Melissa, for being here again and answering any questions that we may have. Did anyone have any recollections of some of the possible items we discussed back in November? I have a couple notes that I can share too. So, Lee.
Yeah. Well, as Melissa knows, I've seen and heard different versions of the city's presentation several times. And they're all informative, and they all reflect a huge amount of research and interagency conversation with our neighbors and with the Coastal Commission staff on how best to realize the city general plan and charter, and also be true to the goals and objectives of the California Coastal Act. And I think that the draft that the staff is bringing forward now is really, really successful in almost all those areas. So my compliments to you and Rosie and Deborah and Renee and everybody else I'm forgetting. My main question has to do with the area around the railroad tracks below the freeway. The Coastal Act has a stated priority for marine commerce related business and coastal and visitor serving with a desire to get smaller, more affordable visitor opportunities in the city. And as I've seen the very rapid transition of what is now called the Funk Zone, which has come very legally, but generally at the expense of that very diverse group of industrial and manufacturing and often marine-related and fishing-related support industries. I'm wondering if you feel like we still have that balance between giving affordable space close to the harbor and close to the channel for business and industries that have traditionally been related to the water and to the fisheries, because I keep looking at it and sometimes the words are there, but it's hard to find.
Yeah, that's a tricky balance down there in the funk zone. The Coastal Act protects not just coastal dependent industries, so that would be harbor uses and fish markets and that kind of thing, but also what's called visitor serving businesses, which include restaurants and shops and even breweries. And so that area, I didn't bring my land use map today. There's one in here, but that whole area down there has, when the ocean, what's it called now? The ocean related zone, hold on. Ocean commercial, I think it's called. Was created in the HR2 and the HR1. When that originally went through the Coastal Commission and they were certified all those land uses, that was a really important topic at that time, was the balance of uses and where all these coastal dependent uses going to go, and are they going to get priced out by other things? And at that time, the concern was big hotels. I think it's similar now. There's only so much that the Coastal Act can be used to manage uses down there. A lot of it is the city's discretion and whether or not that falls into the Coastal Act. And again, both of those uses are priority in the coastal zone. And so what's in this plan doesn't actually change the land uses down there at all. It carries over the land uses as they've been certified to date. So we really haven't taken on revisioning the uses down there and the mix of them, but there is a priority in the zone for coastal dependent and visitor serving uses, and how that's interpreted at a code level is a subject of the ENZO and other code regulations. This plan does address parking as it might affect public access to the beach and shoreline and coastal recreation. So if you go into the public access section, there's quite a few policies now that could pertain to the funk zone in particular. So that's, I would say, one thing that might affect that area more than others. But
Thanks, Melissa.
yeah.
Lee, did you have further questions? Anyone? Yeah. I think you were unable to attend that meeting. You missed a great presentation and discussion. Betsy, do you want me to just to share some of the things? So some of the notes I had from our meeting was just that the Creeks Advisory Committee would consider for discussion sending a general letter of support for the coastal land use plan updates, in particular for the creek setbacks and the proposed water quality protection and improvements, potentially including a couple of following examples, one being support for the habitat buffers, specifically that the advisory committee generally supports larger creek setbacks to protect creeks and water quality, but we understand that the proposed setbacks in the update are a compromise working within the coastal zone and the constraints of the existing parcels and the land use within that area. And also that moving forward as a city, the Creeks Advisory Committee in the future supports larger creek setbacks. So that was one possible thing we could include in our letter of support. Did you guys want to discuss that at all right now? It was... Melissa wanted to, I think you talked about the setbacks last time. One of you or your other colleague did, but does anyone want a reminder about what the setbacks are? There's a lot of constraints in that area, and it really seemed like they did the best they could within a lot of the existing land use and constraints. If you want to add
I can just remind everyone that the way that the setbacks were created. So the main thing I'm trying to emphasize, and I think would be good to emphasize in a letter, is that these setbacks are really for the reaches of the creeks that are in the coastal zone. And that as a follow-on effort in the next few years, we're going to be updating the environmental resources element, and that will look at creek setbacks for the entire city, not just the coastal zone. And I don't want people glomming onto these specific numbers, thinking that these are going to be the numbers all the way to the edge of the city and to the upper watersheds. These are really very specific to the reaches in the coastal zone, and the reaches in the coastal zone in general are very urban, very built out. The small lots, we have very, very few lots in the coastal zone that aren't developed. And so the way that we develop the setbacks is really to start at 100 feet and look at all the different distances and the parcel configurations, and also the location of habitats, neighboring habitats. And we really tried to get the largest we could, given the existing parcel configurations and the fact that we are not allowed to take people's property. And especially along creeks like Mission Creek, there isn't a lot of room there. So we really tried to strike a balance, and with the setbacks, make them achievable, because if they're not achievable, then we're going to basically be in the situation where we are now of negotiating case-by-case creek setbacks. And so we tried to make them achievable for most parcels. In a few cases, we know already there's going to be a few lots that can't achieve these setbacks, and we have outlined a process in here for when that is the case, what happens. But so did you want me to just remind people of the numbers?
Sure.
So the numbers are, I better remind myself, 35 feet for Mission Creek, top of bank, or 15 feet from Riparian, whichever is farther. That's the smallest one. And then, let's see. Hold on, let me get my table. It's 50 feet from top of bank for Arroyo Burro, Laguna, and Sycamore Creeks, or 25 feet from Riparian, whichever is farther. And then for Lighthouse Creek, Mesa Creek, and Arroyo Honda, the portions of it within the coastal zone are, those are the creeks that have the big canyons coming out from them. There's been a lot of debate about top of bank. And so we just said, let's not define top of bank here anymore, because nobody should be developing in the steep canyons anyways. So basically the habitat buffer is from the top of the canyon, or 25 feet from Oak Woodland or Riparian, whichever is farther. So there's a lot of details about what's allowed within those buffers and that kind of thing. And then in addition, there's other minimum setbacks for other types of habitat. So Oak Woodland, Southern Coastal Bluff Scrub, native grasslands, and we can talk about others
Thanks, Melissa. Cameron, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to clarify something, because it almost sounded like she said there wasn't a top of bank defined for those canyon areas, and it's just not defined sort of as a narrative. It's on those three Canyon Creek kind of locations. There's actually a map that has the lines drawn on it, so it's actually probably one of the most easiest to identify top of banks.
Oh, what's defined is the top of canyon, which is the edge of the setback. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Essentially top of bank, but it's top of canyon for those specific creeks. Right. It's okay.
No, we don't need to.
We're not commenting on that as you guys. We don't need to know. Any questions about any of the creek setbacks? I guess the other item I had notes from our previous meeting was just that the Creeks Advisory Committee would possibly consider support for restoration of riparian vegetation. And specifically, it was for projects that are existing, that have existing degraded vegetation on site, and that as part of that project, they should be required to improve the riparian habitat as mitigation. Did you?
Do you want me to come?
Yeah, could you add to that, please?
We have talked about that. I definitely think where we have cases of reduced setbacks, that should be required, because at that point we're saying that you don't have enough. Yeah. We have encouraged it in this policies, but we have not made it required for every project that's next to a creek. But if you want to make that comment, that's fine.
Yeah. And yeah, Chrissy, I think you might have something to say about this.
I think anytime there's an opportunity to increase roughness and slow the water down, I think that's a really good thing, especially in light of what just recently happened. Not that would have ameliorated the situation at all, but and having said that, though, with riparian vegetation, because we all know that there are way too many ornamentals that encroach into our Santa Barbara front country creeks. So if we could make sure we use the word native vegetation.
Riparian native vegetation?
Yes.
I would just add that within the buffers, there are very specific planting guidelines, and that require use of native vegetation. So that is going to be a form moving forward of restoration. So I just would point that out.
That was kind of what I had for notes for issues related to what the Creeks Advisory Committee could express support for or possibly suggestions for. Did anyone have any additional?
Madam Chair, I would ask the committee to move acceptance and adoption of the chair's recommendations and direct the staff to compile them and convey them to other parts of the city in time for the next round of hearings.
Excellent. Thanks, Lee. Could I have a second?
I'll second that.
A second. And I'll... Oh, sorry. Sure, please. We now have a... Do you say it G? J. We now have a public comment from Jay Goolsby. And then we'll get back to her.
I just want to say that the reason why people are here is because of the creeks. That people, when they
We got to turn your mic on.
people have migrated around the world and so forth, and they go to places where there are creeks or rivers to live, and that drew people here, of course. And there were several beautiful creeks, and the reason it got its name was because there was also hot springs, which is where Barton Mound is now. Nobody knows about it anymore; it's hidden. But the water is just kind of a wonderful natural attraction, and I think to have trails along the creeks, if possible, where people could walk, the creeks be really wonderful, and I think it fits in with the setbacks that gives people the space. Some cities have bike paths or bike trails along the creeks and pedestrian things, and I have had the opportunity to visit those places, and it's really wonderful to be able to you're in the middle of town, but you're going through creek. You don't feel like you're in the middle of town when you're just going down the creek lines.
Thank you, G. G. Did I get it? J. So I believe we had a motion, and we had a second, and all in favor. I think he made the motion, so we're okay to continue.
We've got a quorum.
All in favor? Aye. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Melissa, for being here to answer questions and revisit. Oh, and he's returning. So I have an old agenda. Is that our last item of business? Nope. We have more.
One more, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you. So we're moving on to item C, 2018 regular meeting schedule. Cameron? Thank you.
Yes, Madam Chair. I don't know what I did with my copy of the schedule, but included in your packet, there's a draft meeting schedule for 2018. Normally, we meet the third Wednesday of every month, but there are a couple of exceptions to that because of the holidays towards the end of the year, so those dates are a little different, and we try to meet in this space, the David Gebhard Meeting Room, is our regular location, but sometimes there are conflicts, and so you'll see that there are different locations, city council chambers, sometimes the Parks and Recreation Conference Room, where you'll see different locations, but that's our proposed meeting calendar for the rest of 2018, and up to the committee to review and make any changes and adopt.
Thanks, Cameron. Does anyone have any comments about the upcoming calendar for 2018? Excellent. Would anyone like to make a recommendation? Can I do it? Go for it, Betsy.
I recommend we approve the calendar as proposed for 2018.
Second.
Excellent. All in favor? Aye. Excellent. I believe that wraps up our business for this evening.
Move to adjourn, Madam Chair.
Excellent. I can second that. All in favor? Do we have to vote? Aye. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
There will be other songs to sing, another fall, another spring, but there will never be another you. There will be other lips that I might kiss, but theirs won't thrill me like yours used to do. Oh, I may dream a million dreams, but how can they come true? 'Cause there